The Falcons need their offense to make a massive leap if they plan on snapping their 7-year playoff drought in 2025.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everyday is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is part one of our two-part season preview, where I will be projecting stats for the Falcons offense. I'll answer some of the big questions about whether or not this Falcons offense will grow in Michael Penix's first year as a full-time starter. And of course, we'll also break down what I expect the Falcons' final record to be in 2025. And without further ado, let's get into that. I have the Falcons finishing with a final record of 9-8. We'll go through the schedule. I have them in week one, getting that W against the Bucs, getting their season off to a good start, but then dropping that week two game to the Vikings, then coming back and winning on the road against the Carolina Panthers in week three, then losing at home in week four against the Commanders. They have their week 5 bye, and then they follow up with 2 losses to the Bills and 49ers to get off to a 2-4 start this season. But then we get into the quote-unquote soft part of the schedule, and this is where the Falcons can make up some ground. I have them winning at home against the Dolphins, then going on the road and losing to the Patriots, winning against the Colts in Germany, and then losing against the Panthers at home in week 11, and following that up with 3 consecutive wins on the road against the Saints and Jets in weeks 12 and 13, and then another home win against the Seahawks in week 14. And that gets us into December, where, it becomes all about the Falcons. Can they get this thing back on track and make a push for the playoffs? And I have them losing against the Bucs in week 15 on Thursday night, a win against the Cardinals on the road in week 16, a loss at home against the Rams on prime time, and then finishing the season with a sweep of the New Orleans Saints to get to that 9-8 record. And so, have them with a 5-3 home record, a 5-4 away record, a 4-2 in the division. And, I know some of you guys are looking at some of these projections and being like, oh, I have the Falcons winning that game and you have them losing. And, this thing, you guys know how this goes. You've been Falcon fans for long enough where, there's always a game or two that the Falcons have no business losing, that they wind up, losing, and there's a game or two that we're like, oh, they're not going to win that game, and then they wind up winning that game. And we're at, my projection is similar to where we've been the last couple of years, going into like the Thanksgiving, that week 13, November 30th game against the Jets. That's Thanksgiving weekend. That's a Sunday after Thanksgiving, and I have the Falcons through that game having a 6-6 record. They've been like 6-6 and 6-7 at the same point in previous years. In those previous years doing these projections, I always had the Falcons finishing really strong, whether it was winning 4 out of the last 5 or their last 4 or whatever, to get to 10 wins. I've learned my lesson, and I only have the Falcons finishing 3-2 to close out the season after Thanksgiving. So, of course, this is going to be the final year, the year where they finally, win 4 out of the last 5 or rattle off 4 straight wins to get to 10 or more wins. So we'll see on that front. But, for me, this team has always kind of felt like an 8 or 9 win team, right? There was a point during the early parts of camp that I was like, oh, maybe they are going to be this 10 win team, right? Because I think in part I was kind of buying some of the hype coming out around the defense at that point in time, and then we got to the preseason. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is more hype than substance, right? Where, when we were talking about like, James Pierce and all those guys and some of these rookies, really coming in and taking the league by storm. But I don't know if we'll live up to that, but we'll talk more about the defense on tomorrow's part 2 season preview. But, I think if this team is going to exceed, these expectations of being a 9-8 team and be that 10+ win team, I think a lot of it, will depend on the defense, but most of it will depend on the offense being significantly better than where I'm currently projecting them to be. And while I'm very optimistic about what this offense can be, I'm basically in wait and see mode, right? Where it's just like, I will believe it when I see it, because they have a lot of questions on offense. Many of them I'm optimistic about, them going, the arrow pointing up and getting positive feedback, I guess you could say, on those questions. But it's harder for me to basically be as optimistic as maybe some other people are, because so many of them are unknown. So many of them are just like, based off of what we have seen so far, there's not that much reason to think it's going to be significantly better. But I do think when we talk about those bets that they're making on offense with some of those question marks, I do think it's reasonable to think that most of them will pay off. Most of them we will get positive outcomes. Just the question of how positive those outcomes are going to be. And we'll dive into what those questions and those bets are as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, the NFL season is back, and there's nothing better than getting into the stadium surrounded by fans and cheering on the Falcons. But let's be honest, getting tickets can be a hassle, and that's why you got to use Game Time. They're taking the hassle out of buying tickets and giving it back, the advantage back to you, the fans. It's fast, it's easy, it's backed by the Game Time guarantee, where you'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all the fees are included, so the price you see is what you pay, and what you see is what you get with those panoramic seat views. And the money you save with Game Time, you can now spend on, cheap concessions over at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. And today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. With the NFL season almost here, FanDuel is going to make sure that you are ready for kickoff with this can't miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app, where you can bet on a variety of ways to win, right? If you feel like, it's going to be a big week for a specific player, you go with a player prop. If you feel like different things, you got that hunch that different things are going to happen in the game, that's a same game parlay. FanDuel gives you so many ways to win, and you get a little bit of action to keep things interesting, all that sort of stuff. So, if you're ready to play, make sure you download the FanDuel app today by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. Again, if you win your first $5 bet, you get $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet today. So before we get into some of the big questions surrounding this Falcons offense, I want to let you guys know that Locked On wants to hear from you. We've put together a survey to learn more about our listeners and make your favorite podcast even better. This is your chance to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and answer any questions that we have about our advertising. All you got to do is go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey to get started. And everyone who completes the survey will be entered for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Amazon gift cards. Again, that's lockedonpodcast.com/survey. And you can also find the link in the description below. So thank you for helping us out. Now, when we talk about the Falcons offense, as I said earlier, I think there's reasonably good bets that the Falcons are making when it comes to their offense, given some of these unknowns that they have, like about Michael Penix, about Zach Robinson making that jump in year 2, getting more out of some of their, lesser playmakers like Kyle Pitts, on the offensive line, Matthew Bergeron, Ryan Newsel making leaps. I think the majority of those bets should pay off in a major way. Now, starting with Michael Penix, that big bet is on him enhancing the explosiveness of this offense due to his big time arm talent, due to his willingness to push the ball down the field. So it's the idea that you're going to get higher highs more consistently with Penix at the helm at quarterback than you were with Kirk Cousins. And you're hopefully not going to get as many low lows, right? You're going to get a less chaotic quarterback than what Kirk Cousins was for the Falcons, right? And that's a large part of that is betting on that Penix so far, from college as well as 3 starts in the NFL, is not a guy that is known for generating a bunch of negative plays, right? Not a lot of sacks, not a lot of interceptions. He's kind of the day walker, right? To use a 25-year-old reference going back to Blade. But, you get the strengths of Kirk, of an efficient quarterback like Kirk, and none of the weaknesses of sort of Kirk. And so the hope is that we're going to have Kirktober, all season long, instead of that being a 1-month phenomenon that we had last year with Kirk Cousins. That could be a 3 or 4 month phenomenon with Michael Penix. And I'm optimistic that Penix can, deliver on some of this expectations and optimism. But at the same time, he is also a young quarterback. And that may mean that, even though we might get some of these high highs, there may be a little bit more of a roller coaster. There may be a lot more ups and downs that come with him being a young quarterback than a lot of us are anticipating. And, does that limit the Falcons' ability to sort of reach their potential? So that's a open question. Now, when we talk about Zach Robinson going into year 2, we've seen consistent growth for the last 4 Falcons play callers going into their second year, going back to Kyle Shanahan, Steve Sarkisian, Dirk Cutter, and Arthur Smith. And 2 of the major areas for growth that we're looking for with Zach Robinson is more play action, a more diversified run game. And the Falcons have said all the right things this offseason. They said we're planning on doing this, but it's essentially you got to believe it when you see it. For example, the Falcons were dead last in the NFL in play action usage at 14%. And if they increase that to 18%, I don't think that's really doing anything to move the needle. Now, if they increase that 14% to 24% or 28% or higher, then all of a sudden, I think we are doing significantly more this season when it comes to how we're utilizing the play action. But it's not just simply, hey, we'll just dial up more play action that will automatically solve the problem. A lot of it has to depend on how effective is that play action, right? They were dead last year in completion rate off of play action, touchdowns off of play action, passer rating off of play action. They were bottom 10 in yards per attempt off of play action. And you compare that to a team like Tampa Bay, who was 24th in usage. So they didn't throw a lot of play action, but they were very effective. They were pretty much top 10 across the board in terms of their effectiveness when it came to when they utilized play action, even if it wasn't a huge feature part of their offense. And so, you couple those issues with, and then again, that's a big reason why I think Tampa Bay wound up finishing as a top 5 to 7 offense last year, which is again the goal that the Falcons want to reach. But dialing up more play action, diversifying the run game, I think can help these offensive line, particularly with the injury to Kaleb McGary, the season-ending injury, where you're gonna, when you dial up play action, you're gonna have his replacements, Elijah Wilkinson in week 1, and then we'll see, with Storm Norton and others after that point. But, those guys are going to be asked less to basically hold up on an island in pass protection if you can dial up a lot more play action. The diversified run game should help those guys too. Not only could it help generate more explosive runs for your running backs like Bijan Robinson, but, without Kaleb McGary, are you going to be able to rely on your outside zone run scheme as much as you did last year to be as effective, right? The answer is probably not, but we'll see. And, again, the question is going to be, do you have those so-called mixers, as Zach Robinson spoke about, in terms of your run game? And, these are some of the things that we expect to see the Falcons to do even before the Kaleb McGary injury. And now it's kind of critical that they do these things after the Kaleb McGary injury, or this offense has the potential to disappoint. And, McGary's injury does raise more questions on the offensive line that already had those questions. You kind of need Matthew Bergeron, before to make a leap. But before, it was kind of a bonus, but now it's kind of critical, because before McGary's injury, you had 3 relatively known commodities of quality play on your offensive line with McGary and Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom. And now you take one of those pieces away, and basically you kind of need Bergeron to sort of assume the role as that third guy that is a impactful blocker. And then, you throw the center conversation, which was our biggest question mark throughout the offseason. Is Ryan Nuzul a significant drop off for Drew Dahlman, right? I don't need Ryan Nuzul to be the 9th best center in the NFL, but I do need him to be better than the 29th best center in the NFL. And basically for me, it's like, okay, well, if we can split the difference and get to 19, right? If he's the 19th best center in the NFL, that to me is a win for this Falcons offensive line. And so that, coupled with, can you get steady play from Elijah Wilkinson and others at that right tackle position this upcoming season, with Kaleb McGary going down for the year, We saw a revolving door left guard the last time Elijah Wilkinson started games for the Falcons back in 2022, and it did not hurt this offense in the slightest, regardless of who they had at that left guard position. And I think a big part of that was the continuity and consistency that you had at the other four positions. And so you kind of need that again this upcoming season. And so that does include Bergeron and Newsel sort of stepping up and playing better to allow you to have that continuity and consistency at the other four spots, in addition to the right tackle position. Now, you talk about Kyle Pitts. Can you get more out of Kyle Pitts? You know, he was kind of an afterthought in the offense last year. Is he going to be featured more? Right? We know Michael Penix wants to get him the ball. Will he be able to get him the ball effectively? Take advantage of Kyle Pitts' unique, explosive skill set for a tight end, make this offense harder to defend, because instead of having to defend the big three and Bijan, Drake London, and Darnell Mooney, you know, can you make it a big 4.5 or a big 4 or a big 3.5 at the very least, where, you know, half the games Kyle Pitts is sort of that fourth guy. And so that's going to be a question. And, you know, how consistent can Kyle Pitts be, right? We talk about Kyle Pitts' usage and where the coaching staff and maybe the quarterback play has let him down in the past, but at the same time, Kyle Pitts also bears some responsibility for the disappointment because he's not been as consistent, right? And that is especially true when it comes to him being a factor in the red zone, right? Can he be a more reliable option in the red zone and give the Falcons, you know, in addition to Drake London and Bijan Robinson, who are going to be their primary guys that win in the red zone, can they get a third option in the red zone? Will they get more consistent play from him? So, you know, not only do you need these quote unquote mid-tier players like the Bergerons, like the Kyle Pittses, et cetera, to sort of step up, then you also have the question of like your big three, right? Can you get more out of those guys? Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and Darnell Mooney. How much meat is left on that bone? And again, when you put it all together, I think there are reasonably good bets that the Falcons are making. I think we will see improvement overall across the board, but it's just a question of how much improvement. Like, for example, like for me, Zach Robinson was the 18th best play caller in the NFL last year, right? I want to have a conversation where Zach Robinson is the 8th best play caller in the NFL this upcoming season, you know, but if he improves, but he only improves from 18 to 14, is that going to really move the needle for you offensively to the degree that I think the Falcons need it to in order for them to reach their goals this upcoming season? So I sit here and I say with confidence that I think we will see across the board some leaps forward, right? At least, at the very least, small leaps forward, whether we're talking about Zach Robinson, Michael Penix, you know, Matthew Bergeron, Kyle Pitts, et cetera. But really the question is, will we get the massive leap forward that we really need, right? And that's where my enthusiasm gets tempered a little bit because it's like, you know, we might get one, maybe two of these bets get a massive leap forward, you know, in terms of Penix being significant upgrade over Kirk Cousins, Zach Robinson's year 2 or whatever. But you kind of, in order for this team to reach its full ceiling of being that top 5 offense, you kind of need all of these bets to pay off, all of these to be a massive leap forward. Kyle Pitts, instead of being the 15th best tight end in the NFL, to be the 5th best tight end in the NFL, right? Michael Penix being a top 10 quarterback this upcoming season and whatnot. And so, you know, I feel like as we sit here today, like a year from now, I'll be a lot more optimistic, you know, once we see this in reality this upcoming season, that that type of leap, that type of massive leap could happen, more likely to happen in 2026 than it is in 2025, but without sort of the proven option, you know what I'm saying? Like we haven't seen it yet. And so a year from now, I'll be like, oh yeah, of course they're going to make a massive leap because we've seen it bear out over the course of this upcoming season. But right now it's a lot of sight unseen to be making those bets. And again, that's what tempers a lot of my enthusiasm for how good this team is going to be. But, you know, as I often say, I'll believe it when I see it on this team. Is not that I don't believe we won't see it, but it's kind of in wait and see mode at this point in time. So we'll see what type of leap this team can make. But in the, you know, meantime, to wrap up today's episode, let's get into, you know, some of the statistical, let's get into some tangible expectations for this team and look at some projections that I have made for how many touchdowns Michael Penix is going to throw. Can Bijan Robinson break 1,500 yards rushing? Will Darnell Mooney have that 1,000-yard season that eluded him last year? Will Drake London lead the NFL in receptions? You know, what does a bounce-back year, if we can call that, for Kyle Pitts look like? And we'll answer all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Fantasy football season is back, and you can feel that buzz in the air with everybody researching, drafting, and building their championship squads. But if you haven't started or joined the league yet, it's now is the time. And why not do so on Yahoo Fantasy? I am, and you should too, whether you're a first timer or a veteran making your millionth league. With the season kickoff on September 4th, it is time to start playing on Yahoo Fantasy with so many fun ways to win and compete. Try the brand new Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine League mode, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated weekly until one team is left standing. If you want to play instantly with your friends, try the new Draft with Friends mode. If you prefer the classics, get your crew together and go head to head in a private league. And if you don't have a crew, no problem, just join a public league. It's the easiest way to play. The NFL season kicks off on September 4th, so don't wait. Start your league now and draft now at yahoofantasy.com/lockedonnfl. That's yahoofantasy.com/lockedonnfl. And most people can't quite name their financial accounts and even what they're worth, whether we're talking 401ks, properties, investments. And when you don't have a full financial picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, the all-in-one personal finance tool that's going to bring your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface, whether it's on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch's going to do the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever having to touch a spreadsheet. You can cancel subscriptions, right? Immediately spotted a few subscriptions when I joined Monarch Money that I wasn't even using, and canceling those alone has saved me money every single month. So don't let the financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with the code LOCKEDONNFL. So, we're going to get into some statistical projections. As you guys well know, this is just guessing. I think it's educated guessing. It's not just me completely pulling numbers out of my butt, but, it's butt adjacent. But in general, these projections have been pretty spot on at various points. Sometimes they're way off and sometimes they're pretty spot on. Like, for example, last year with Drake London, my projection for him was off by one catch, 32 yards and one touchdown. So essentially that 130-yard touchdown he had against the Raiders on that sluggo was basically how far off my projection was for Drake London. Last year, I projected 106 targets for Kyle Pitts. 106 targets went actually to Darnell Mooney. I had 87 targets for Darnell Mooney. Well, 87 targets went to Ray McLeod. Last year, I had a combined amount of targets for the number 3 wide receiver, which I thought was going to be split between Ray McLeod and Kadero Hodge, with 68. And that was almost as many targets, 74, that Kyle Pitts had. So it was, ballpark in terms of accuracy, just not the right player and whatnot. So that being said, let's get into the passing stat projections I have for Michael Penix, throwing for over 4,200 yards, 25 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, passer rating of 95, have him completing 63% of his 536 pass attempts this upcoming season. Kirk Cousins, I do have him getting a little bit of action, going 20 for 32 this year for 237 yards, a touchdown, and interception. Penix's adjusted net yards per attempt, or ANYA, is 7.27, which would, based off of last year's passing stats, would put him in the top 10, right? Joe Burrow was at, I think, 7.28 at 8th last year, and Justin Herbert was like 9th at 7.25. So that's a top 10 guy. Part of that efficiency in ANYA is our preferred here on Locked On Falcons, our preferred passing efficiency metric, is due to those low negative plays that we talked about earlier, where I have Penix having an interception rate of 1.8%, which would have finished just outside the top 10 last year among quarterbacks, a low sack rate of 4.8%, which would have been in the top 10. Now, his completion rate is a little low, which hurts his passer rating more so than it hurts his adjusted net yards per attempt. And again, that 63% would be about 24th percentile among starting quarterbacks over the last 3 years combined. So in the bottom quartile. So basically the bottom 8 of the NFL on an annual basis. But overall, a solid debut season for Michael Penix, and certainly something that I think can potentially be built off of in the years to come. Now, when we look at the rushing stats, I have Bijan Robinson rushing 298 times for 1,299 yards, 4.4 yards per carry, 13 touchdowns. Tyler Algier, 108 carries, 458 yards, 4.2 yards per carry, and 3 touchdowns. And basically, the McGary injury kind of impacted my projections pretty significantly, right? Like, before the McGary injury, there was potentially a world where I would have projected Bijan to get, over 1,500, possibly even over 1,600 yards rushing this upcoming season and be in a position to lead the NFL in rushing this season. But that injury to McGary basically has changed my projections, where I think the Falcons are not going to run the ball quite as frequently, only about 2 carries per game less than previously. And I do think they'll be a little less effective when they do run the ball than they were a year ago. But I think overall, I'm still projecting their rushing attack based off of like total rushing yards to finish somewhere in that 12 to 15 range. Without the McGary injury, I think we would have probably been projecting them somewhere in the top 8 or so, which initially may not seem as impressive. But for most of the teams that finish in the top 8, a lot of those teams are getting, 600 to 900 yards of additional rushing from their quarterback. And meanwhile, my projections only have Michael Penix barely cracking 100 yards rushing this season on 36 carries with 1 rushing touchdown. And so basically top 8 without having the QB run game being a significant part of it. Basically, that was me suggesting that before the McGary injury, the Falcons would, in theory, have a top 5-ish rushing game as a top 8 rushing team when you factor out all the teams that get a boost from the quarterback run game, where the Falcons are not necessarily getting that boost. And so, I feel like that's not completely out the window, but I do feel like getting in the 12 to 15 range is an accomplishment given the loss of McGary. Basically, the way I factored it in statistically is losing McGary for the season is effectively losing 300 to 400 yards rushing from your season total and whatnot. So that's where I have the Falcons rushing. Let's look at the receiving. Very similar numbers for Drake London from a year ago. I have him leading the team with 104 catches, 1,393 yards, and 10 touchdowns. Darnell Mooney does barely crack 1,000 yards with 62 catches, 1,002 yards, 5 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts is not drastically better statistically with 50 catches this year, 702 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Just slight improvements from last year's totals. And Ray-Ray McCloud takes a dip from last year, where he only has his 45 catches, 512 yards, and a touchdown. So basically very similar to last year's offense, just with a little less Ray-Ray McCloud being featured in the offense is where I'm projecting this year's offense to be. It's basically, in terms of overall volume or pass attempts, it's about the same. I think it's off by like 7 pass attempts or 9 pass attempts or something like that difference from last year to this year based on my projections, but you're getting a lot more yards or significantly more yards with it. And you see that reflected with the yards per reception for the top 4 receivers, where, London had 12.7 yards per reception last year. I have him now projecting at 13.4. Mooney, 15.5 in 2024, projecting him at 16.2. Kyle Pitts was 12.8 in 2024, now projecting him with 14. And then Ray-Ray McCloud was at 11.1 last year, and now I have him slightly bumped at 11.4. So those are kind of my statistical projections for the Falcons. I'm sure many of you guys think some of them are too high, too low. It'll be fascinating to sort of see, which ones are accurate, which ones are completely off the mark. There will be certainly some that will be in both categories this year, because that's been the consistent theme these last, 3 or 4 years that I've been doing this. So we will see on that front. But, we're not done with our season preview because, we talked a lot about the offense, but what about the defense, right? We have major questions on the defense. We have stats and sacks to project on the defensive side of the ball. I'll also be breaking down sort of what my predictions for the rest of the league are with my playoff teams and my Super Bowl pick. If it wasn't clear, I do not have the Falcons making the playoffs at the top of the episode. I'm sorry. I should have probably led with that. The 9-8 record snaps their losing streak, but it's not going to be good enough based off my projections for this team to get in on a wild card spot. So the fact that I didn't say that at the top probably hinted that I did not expect that, but I should probably clarify that for you guys. So That is all in store for you on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And in the meantime, if you want to get more insight into what's going on around the rest of the league, Locked On NFL has the NFL season previews. Every division winner, breakout stars, and Super Bowl contender is an 8-episode series with everything you need to know about this upcoming NFL season. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.